Hey everyone, this is smpratte, and we're finally going to talk about the E-Series sets. I know a ton of people wanted me to cover these, so I'm going to start with Expedition, end with Skyridge. Ideally, I'd like to cover every set at some point. Not sure if that's realistic, but I will try and pepper in the E-Series releases here and there as we move along. I might even redo the original set videos when I was still trying to figure out how to YouTube. But nonetheless, today we're going to talk about Expedition and the E-Series release in general. So starting with Expedition, this set was released in Japan 2001, the US September 2002. It was the largest set to date at that time with 165 cards on the English side. And I think when most people think of Expedition or the E-Series era, that thought is synonymous with the thick yellow border. In my opinion, the E-Series era is somewhat like modern art, where you need to understand the history, the symbolism, the explanation behind it to fully appreciate what it has to offer. So this E-Series design, this thick yellow border, was made for the Game Boy Advanced e-reader. There was that dot technology that you could swipe and the data would enter into the game. Interestingly enough, on the Japanese side, they produced reverse holo cards, which typically were only on the English side, but they did this on the Japanese end because the e-reader with the holographic pattern was thrown off with that dot technology. So therefore, only the reverse holo cards, the reverse Japanese holo cards of holo variants, actually have the dot data on the card. So that's just one important distinction in relation to the history of the E-Series era. However, in my opinion, this is the biggest transitional time for Pokemon. This was Pokemon's adolescence. This was the teen years for Pokemon. This is when Pokemon was trying to figure out what it was going to do. You know, it started its expedition, made its way up the mountain, Skyridge. That is what this era is for me. It's just the transitional point when Pokemon was, you know, listening to Eminem, the real Slim Shady, bleaching his hair blonde. That is what was going on with the E-Series. So this, for me, is one of the most historic moments in the Pokemon TCG. And for a counterintuitive reason, because if you really examine the E-Series era, it was one of the lowest points in time for Pokemon. There was such a transition going on, not only within Wizards of the Coast, the company itself, but also the market at large. The market depreciated significantly from that original massive boom. 2002, around there, is when it really started to drop off. Also, within Wizards of the Coast, the licensing and the transition from that, just from the template, the early template to the e-card template, was a long process. In fact, you have the sample set, you have some of those cards from the event where they gave you the sample and understand how this is going to work with the e-card design. You also have the FPOs. There's just a lot of history that only exemplifies how this was a transitional point in the TCG. Also, when we're talking about Wizards of the Coast and the booster packs decreased in quantity. You know, in Expedition, you had 9 cards instead of your normal 11. Also plays into the licensing costs. This was really just a transitional time for Wizards of the Coast, and this is partly why I think it did end, is if you couple in the decline in the market, all the costs from transitioning, the idea of selling the franchise was, you know, something optimal for them, or it was, you know, a moment when that sounded like a way out. So that is the brief overview for that time frame. But in my opinion, the more philosophical aspect behind the E-Series era, the silver lining behind this is that because this was the lowest point, the quantity today is probably the scarcest of any set. I think the E-Series era, Expedition all the way to Skyridge, and a little bit of that early Nintendo is probably the scarcest amount of product you'll see for any set release. You know, I am doing right now binder projects for pretty much every set moving forward. I'm having to buy more doubles that I already have because I want to do different layouts for different binders. And in this process, the most difficult sets for me to attain are the E-Series release, because you have such a low quantity produced back in the day, therefore not as much is available. Coupled with 165 cards in a set, it makes it a very, very difficult challenge. So that is the silver lining for collectors who want that challenge. That is what the E-Series is going to provide. But moreover, I think for me, when I think of the E-Series, I think of it more as a journey. You know, it is that expedition to the mountaintop where Pokemon is trying to figure out what their identity is. You know, what's going on. They're trying to figure out, who am I? You know, what am I going to be moving forward? And in that transition, you know, they passed the baton of first edition over to Japanese. It ended from English and began on the Japanese side. And I think for people who value the history, this set really provides exactly that. This represents that moment in time where Pokemon was trying to figure out what it was going to do, where it was going to go. It was a huge drop off. It was the lowest point in the hobby for the market side of things. So therefore, that is what the E series represents for me. For Base, Jungle, Fossil, and Rocket, I think more of the aesthetics and my experience at that time. However, for the E series, I think of it more, again, as this large journey, if that makes sense. However cringy or cheesy that sounds, that's how I always perceive the E series. It's just one big experience. I don't see it as Expedition, Aquapolis, or Skyridge. It's just one big experience. Of course, I know the implementation of crystal cards and other, subtleties there. It does give it something unique, but nonetheless, that's my experience with the cards. Also, I think one other important aspect when we're talking about E series in general, whenever people see the design, I think it throws them off. I think older collectors, when they see this thick border, it looks like the card's off-center because centering is usually designated by the overall border layout, which usually is even, where this looks like it's permanently off-centered. Also, this cuts out a bit more of the art than the rectangle design. But I think the biggest dilemma for the E-Series release is that it doesn't have a strong identity in relation to generations of Pokemon. So if you think about Gen 1, it's synonymous with Base, Jungle, Fossil. And then if you think about Gen 2, it's synonymous with, Genesis to Destiny. And the thing about the E-Series is that it was just plopped right in there in between Gen 2 and Gen 3. So it has somewhat of a gray identity. It's somewhat of, again, this adolescent identity. It's just walking around with this Walkman on day, doesn't want to talk to his parents. That's what the E-Series is for me. It's this very transitional point, especially in relation to the generations. It doesn't tie into one generation specifically, where if you look at, say, Ruby Sapphire, that ties directly into that new era of Nintendo. That original EX, you think Ruby Sapphire, Fire Red, Leaf Green, because it ties into that Gen 3 time. And if you think, again, about Diamond and Pearl and so on and so forth, Black and White, each release has some nuance in card layout or design. Heart Gold, Soul Silver is, again, another example of how the card layout was in line with a release of a game. So that is something else I think is somewhat of a change up for the E-Series, is that it really didn't fall in line with one generation. It's in between two generations. So I think that's why people tend to pass over it, because there's a lot of artwork in this era that's underrated. Even for me, sometimes I forget about artwork in the E-Series more than any other series because it is so underrated. I think that design, for people who grew up with the original design, they usually prefer that over the E card. Of course, that's not true universally, but in general, that's usually the trend. So therefore, I think a lot of people steer clear of it and they miss out on a lot of quality art. So the E-Series is very unique. It's one of those sets that I could really talk about for a very long time in a way that is more philosophical than others, in that I would talk about this and discuss it more about its identity versus its actual aesthetics. Because I think the aesthetics for a lot of people are mixed feelings. And I think for people who appreciate the history, they absolutely love the E-Series era. For people who don't either know about the history, don't appreciate it, it's kind of a love or hate type thing. They really either love it or they don't like it at all. So it's just very unique. I really can't think of a more unique release in relation to historical aspects, in relation to, identity and trying to figure out what was going on in Pokemon than the E-Series era. There's no time in Pokemon that was more of a transition, than this. With the bleach blonde hair, that's what you think. That's what I think of whenever I think of the E-Series release. But that's part of the identity of Pokemon. If you are here to collect everything, if you're here to value the history of the CCG, this is just one of those times, one of the unique adolescent times, the growing pains of Pokemon. And I think if you look at the cards, it really represents and delivers that history, especially when you know the information we look at, you're like, oh yeah, that's when Pokemon did the e-reader, that's when they had the dot technology, etc. So that is it for the e-cards. This is more about the E-Series than actual Expedition. I will say that I think the Expedition cards are collectible, but not to the extent that the original Wizards of the Coast era is collectible. Also, I think a lot of people want to know, do you think this is underrated? I think it's underrated for its scarcity. Does that mean it's going to spike in price? No. I would expect actually the original EX era to spike before the Expedition set. And that's because the Expedition set doesn't have the crystal cards. The crystal cards are going to be something that's going to set them apart. However, there are plenty of cards like Charizard, your big species. There's plenty of bigger names in this set to collect. However, I don't think it's significantly underrated in relation to valuation. And that's something I rarely would say, but I only say it with the E series because over the past decade, the prices have pretty much been the same. Then again, could be Legendary Collection. All of a sudden, Legendary Collection just shot up. It was like that for a long time with Legendary, and then all of a sudden it exploded. So you never know. But in my experience, that's what it's been for the E series, specifically Expedition, because it doesn't have those crystal cards. Nonetheless, in my opinion, it fully represents that time more than any other set. So that's my take on it. If you have any questions, any thoughts, as usual, let me know. Hopefully it's helped you out in some way. Till next time, guys.